Welcome, everyone. A year ago, we launched MOYA Talks as a way to elevate the diversity of voices that we have at MOYA and to get to know other people that are not from MOYA. And we decided to do it in February to celebrate and commemorate Black History Month with a panel of outstanding speakers. All the speakers are on YouTube. You can check those talks from last year. And as we start a three-part series on Black History Month, we want to celebrate our newest member, Johnathan Styles, project architect and AIA NCARB. Johnathan, welcome to MOYA Talks.
Thank you for having me.
So let's get to it, Johnathan. What drew you to architecture?
It's a little bit of an embarrassing story, but I'll share it. So I saw a very popular movie that came out in the late 90s of a famous ship that sank. I won't go too deeply into it. But from that point, I wanted to design cruise ships. And so that's what I did all throughout my high school years. And then when I got to college, I realized, it would be very, fun to go into maybe designing buildings instead. And so I transitioned my thought process over to designing buildings, and I've been, in that field ever since.
At least they don't sink.
And they don't sink, exactly. Less liability, let's say that.
How different is the professional practice from the idea that you had?
So most people, I guess, imagine that school doesn't necessarily prepare you for professional practice as well as it should, right? And so basically having to work on a diverse team, being able to coordinate between the different disciplines, the work-life balance professionally, using Revit professionally is very different than using it in school. And so all those things you can't really necessarily get from school. It takes professional practice and going through that kind of trial by fire in order to be able to get that sort of background knowledge. So, and also too, the shocking fact that you don't spend your entire day designing. It's much more involved than that. So that was a big shock between school and professional practice.
You graduated from Florida, so then you went and do a master in London.
Correct.
Are there different approaches to architecture as it's taught, as it's practiced in the UK and the USA?
I think so. There are a lot of overlaps, but I found that when I was studying in the UK, there was a very big emphasis on architecture as it relates to culture. So, and the culture being a part of the context, the urban context, not just the buildings or the history that surrounds it, but also the cultural context. And so my master's degree was cultural identity and globalization. And so basically it boiled down to how do you develop an architectural intervention that both speaks to the physical built environment context, but also the cultural context as well, in terms of the people who will actually be utilizing the space, their various backgrounds, their various ideas on space utilization, but also too, not for the current population, but also how that can be affected over time. Also how different spaces are utilized in different ways throughout the day. So let's say, for instance, if you have a place that is active during the day, once that business or whatever closes down at night, what does that do to the local environment, and how can you activate it after those core hours are over? So taking a look at those kind of things, and I found that was much more deeply ingrained into the education than what my experience was in Florida. That was fascinating.
So there is more cultural awareness of the use of the spaces in the UK.
Correct. And again, just by the nature of the cultural diversity being so condensed in smaller spaces, I think that kind of forces you to deal with those issues much more at the forefront of your design. again, the UK is a very small place with a lot of diversity in certain pockets, whereas the US is a larger country, again with diverse pockets as well, but a little bit more area to spread out by its nature. And so, how do you deal with those kind of compact and very complex social issues while you're designing?
That's a brilliant insight. Has to do a lot with the ways of migration to the United Kingdom too.
Exactly.
But are there any figures that you look to in the design work, designers that you admire, people you have worked with?
So there is a designer that I met when we were both tutoring for people who wanted to take the ARE. Her name is Nicole Hilton. She's a young architect who is in Atlanta, and what's fascinating about her, I found, was that she's my age, 36 years old, and started her own practice maybe 6 or 7 years ago. African-American young lady, which I found very fascinating because, as we'll highlight later on, I mean, the amount of African Americans that are in architecture in general is very, very low. The amount of African Americans that are in leadership roles in architecture is even lower. So to have a African American woman who is a principal and a founder of her own firm is something that's very, very unique. And so I do, in talking to her and hearing her story, was something that I found very, very engaging and very interesting for sure.
You mentioned the low number. As you may know, as I shared with you yesterday, only 2% of registered architects in the USA are African American. You are registered in 2 states.
I am.
What challenges do African American architects face in the process of registry?
I mean, I think the main component is the access to resources, and that's a couple of facets to that. One, being encouraged to actually get licensed. It's one thing to study it, but to have someone say, you should get licensed so that you can so that the fact is that there are no or fewer boundaries in your way to progressing your profession. So hearing that and being encouraged to seek licensure is a huge important aspect. Also, too, being able to either be at a firm that is able to contribute to study resources, materials, and allowing you to actually have time, maybe during work hours or after work, to be able to actually sit down and study for those exams is crucial. And also, to general work-life balance. I mean, African Americans face a lot of issues that other people face in terms of, what if you're a single parent? What if you are the sole breadwinner in your family? What if you have, other family members you have to take care of, or other kinds of responsibilities that eat into your private time? How do you balance work with those professional responsibilities and still have time to be able to sit down and, for these exams? That's a huge part.
Are there built-in incentives in the architectural practice that stop or prevent people from registering?
It can be. I've had fortunately, the firms I've worked for have encouraged registration. But there is a mindset sometimes that gets into people's heads about, well, I don't plan on running my own firm, so why should I get licensed? And it should not be that way. That mindset should not exist, simply because, again, the whole idea professionally should be to make sure that if you can eliminate roadblocks in your path moving forward, and you have the opportunity to do so, you should do that. And so removing the notion of, well, I don't want to run my own practice, so there shouldn't be a reason for me to get licensed. We need to work on changing that mindset and be able to convey other benefits to licensure rather than just saying, that's how you become partner. I mean, it's a huge cultural mindset that needs to be adjusted, I think.
Excellent. The low numbers in the profession means a challenging representation, going back to what we said about cultural sensitivity, both in the practice and the communities architects serve.
Sure.
Have you ever, or do you ever feel additional pressure as a joblike architect within your team or during stakeholder outreach?
Sure. Because because the numbers are so low, because it's so rare for African Americans to be in architecture, you almost feel as though you are carrying the mantle for your people, right? It's kind of you know, not, not really a sexy way to say it, but it's true. Like, you have to be successful because there's a lot riding on this. You have to kind of prove that we can do this. And so you do have a sense of, when you're going into a meeting, you have to represent not only your firm that you're working for, but also you as a person in general. You have to represent yourself well and prove that we are up to the task just like anyone else is, and we are cultured and educated and well versed in experiences like anyone else. And so there is that sort of pressure. Now, granted, you can't dwell on that fact because you kind of have to just kind of get the job done and do it. But it is important to kind of sit back after all that and take a step back and understand the almost monumental responsibility you have as being kind of a representative of, African American architects in general. It is something that on some level does sometimes weigh on the psyche.
You, in your experience, have worked with a lot of building typologies. What is your favorite type of architectural project?
So yeah, I've worked on restaurants. I've worked on some hotels. I've worked on administrative offices and that sort of thing. And definitely anything that touches residential for me have been the most fun projects. Simply because architects uniquely are a unique practice that literally what we do touches every aspect of a person's life day to day. And so when you are responsible for constructing something that people live a huge chunk of their lives in, residential being one of them, it's hugely fascinating to me. And I worked for university housing as an RA and a resident coordinator for 5 years. And so university housing in general was very, very important to me because it's such as you're a college student, your college years and living on campus is such a hugely formative part of your life. And those dormitories or residence halls are places in which you have some of the best and most important memories forged in your life. And so being a part of that whole, being able to create a space where that happens, to me is very, very fascinating. And using those spaces is usually fascinating.
And besides, those are spaces you have used yourself.
Exactly.
You can relate immediately.
Exactly. You can relate to them because, again, you experience those on a day-to-day basis. Exactly.
Who hasn't thought like, oh, if I would do this, I would do it completely different.
I would make this bigger. I would make these, amenities nicer. Oh, I wish we had a pool. I wish we had a gym, X, Y, and Z.
Who designed this?
Who designed this? Right. But then also, too, once you go into architecture, you realize, oh, that's probably why they designed it this way. So.
What would you like to build in your time in MOYA?
That's a deep question. Just to be general, I would just love to design right now I'm on the multifamily side of things. So I would really love to build some really cool multifamily projects. I mean, it's such a fascinating time now to be in multifamily because, now the work and home life has blurred tremendously, right? And so seeing how that affects multifamily is going to be cool because, although COVID situation might change for the better and, quote unquote, go away, the notion of working from home I don't think it's going to necessarily go back to the way it was, right? I mean, the genie's kind of out of the bottle, and more people will be spending more time at home working. And so, how do we transition multifamily from the COVID world to the working from home at least some part of the week is now the norm, and being able to, again, utilize those spaces in general for that hybrid work life? What does that look like? And so I'm excited to be kind of a part of that transitional time period.
You spent some time in Atlanta, Georgia, and there, besides your practice, you were part of the Circle of Trust.
Yes.
And here in DC, you're part of the AIA DC Urban Design Committee. What advice would you give young architects about networking and building connections?
So the funny thing about architecture is that architecture itself as a profession cannot develop if all you do is sit behind a desk and draw. It doesn't quite work that way, right? And so it's a field that's very much heavily based on relationships. And so in order for your practice to grow,
se está uniendo a la reunión.
So apparently my mother just joined the meeting.
Hello, hello, son.
Hi, Mom. So anyway, embarrassing. So uniquely, though, our practice is based on building relationships. And so in order for you to grow as an architect, you need to make connections outside the office. So it could be either making connections with new clients, making connections with new consultants, or even just your fellow architects as well. Because again, like, architecture is very, very rewarding, and it's a tough profession as well. And so being able to be social people who are going through the same daily struggles as you are, and being able to bounce off ideas with them is hugely important. And so I tell budding young architects all the time is networking is absolutely crucial to build connections for today and for your future, because you never know where that next project may come from, where the next job may come from. You never know. So it's always important to get out there and meet other people.
Thank you. What role can architects play in designing exclusive spaces beyond the building itself?
Let's see. So I think from my perspective, I mean, you draw on your own personal experience, and this is also why, networking is important as well, and getting out there and meeting other people. Because if you can have experience with how the way different people utilize spaces, different demographics, different ability levels, different cultural backgrounds, what have you, if you can get a sense of how different people utilize spaces differently, you can internalize that and make sure that when you are designing a space, you can have those ideas in the back of your mind to where you inherently make spaces that are more inclusive, because you do have a various set of experiences to draw from, which can then you can impart on your design strategy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense, but it leads me to another question. Can your personal experience be counterproductive when you think about diversity?
It can be, in the sense that if you only rely on your personal experience to influence your design methodology, that defeats the entire purpose, right? Because again, you have one set of experiences, and if you only design to that, then you only are designing for a limited amount of people who share your same experience. So again, personal experience is hugely important, but the flip side is that you have to reach out to gain perspectives about other people's experiences as well. And I think that a huge benefit to architecture and a huge responsibility to architecture is that the architect has an interest in culture to the point where the exploration of different cultural mindsets should be interesting to that person. I mean, we all, for the most part, have backgrounds where in school there is some kind of architectural history class, right? And that's not just to basically say, you know, what order of column is this, but it also influences you to say, okay, well, this culture designed in such a way to respond to these conditions. And so having that background and then in the present, making those connections to be able to experience other cultures and influences should then give you the tools to make a much more inclusive environment.
And as you mentioned earlier, to anticipate what the space will be used for.
Exactly. I mean, again, architecture is a living, breathing thing, right? It's very dynamic. It's amazing how you design a space last year and you see it being utilized today, and it's being utilized in a completely different way than what you ever would have imagined, right? And so you have to be able to, again, can you anticipate every nuance, every facet? Absolutely not. But to realize that what you designed a building for may not be what it is, what its purpose is, you know, in 6 months, a year, 10 years, and being okay with that and being able to have that kind of dynamism to be able to work with that is hugely important.
Brilliant answer. Johnathan, thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor now so the staff can ask you questions.
Sure.
So please go ahead. Noor, go ahead, please.
Hi, Johnathan. So it's actually a very great talk. I love your background and your master degree background. It's something that I'm very interested in as well. And I have a question for you. There are some architecture buildings that are somehow timeless and can address and speak to each culture. What do you think? How do these architects make this building that way? And I'm curious to know about your thesis, master thesis project as well, if you can just give a brief.
Sure. So I think again, I hope one day to have a building that is this way, that's timeless. But I think what's hugely important about that is that, again, they were able to pull all these various aspects from different references, if you will, to, you know, make a composition that, because it's so varied and so diverse, it's not stuck in one time period, right, or stuck in one context. There's so much that has informed its development that it kind of floats across many different aspects of architecture or culture, right? And so I think that is hugely important. So I think in many ways, the buildings I'm thinking of that are timeless are, you know, are kind of that way. They are a mix of different things. So that's my answer for that. My thesis was a couple of things, and so it was basically how certain aspects of culture that can be somewhat taboo. How do they infect architectural spaces, right? So London, for example, has a unique thing to where, you know, there are religious aspects to architecture, but there are also, or London, but there are also seedier aspects of London as well, right? So, I mean, if you go to London and you go to Soho, for instance, right? I mean, it's flanked by a couple of churches on one end, but as you well know, many of you may know that it's also the red light district, right? So how do those aspects of culture affect that space? And so that was actually my thesis, was how does that dichotomy work exactly? Because, you know, many people, you know, focus on the more family friendly aspects of culture, right? But there are also these kind of behind, you know, back of house, behind the scenes things that also affect how architecture is thought of.
Yeah. Very interesting. Thank you.
Paola has a question. She asked, as you were abroad for some time, what was your most memorable experience? And what city are you daydreaming of going on vacation?
So I'm gonna nerd out here for a little bit. So one of the huge experiences I had, which I look back on, was I was actually at the Diamond Jubilee celebrations of the Queen back in 2012, and it was also the same year as the Olympics as well. And so I was able to experience all of that stuff in London at one time. And so being there for the Jubilee and for the Olympics in London, it was a very cool time to be in London. Probably one of the best times to be in London. There was so many things going on, and there were so many people coming into London as well. So if you wanted to meet anybody, that was the time to be in London for sure. So it was fascinating. Daydreaming about. So I went back to Europe for my grad school reunion a couple of years ago, and I actually had the opportunity to go to Madrid. And I spent it for 3 or 4 days there, and it was not enough. And so I want to go back and explore more of Spain as well. And so at some point, hopefully soon, I can get back there. That's on my top of my list.
Let me know.
I'll look you up.
Paula said, we know someone there. Cool. Any more questions, people?
This is Al. I got. Hi, Johnathan. How are you?
Hi, good. Nice to meet you.
First, let me just say you do my heart well when I look behind you and I see Bomwad, and I say, oh my God, this man draws.
I do still draw
by my own heart.
Yes, I do draw by hand still.
Yes. I was really fascinated with your conversation because it was also a kindred spirit that I felt about the humbling experience of being an architect and the daunting responsibility that you said is I totally agree with, is that architects have this responsibility that everything that everybody does in life, architecture touches it. And so I guess my question is, how do you overcome that fear of that responsibility?
I guess I overcome the fear of it by the love I have for it. You know what I mean? If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's it.
So, again, architecture is probably one of the most rewarding things you could possibly do. And so, and I love doing it. And so, as much as it does sometimes make you very afraid, because again, like we're always learning things, right? There's things that we don't know. I mean, this is my, first week here, and I'm learning new things. That it's just one of those things. And you always seek to get better. I mean, you're never perfect. It's always, a development process. And as long as you're okay with that and understanding that you're always learning, whether or not you are a first-year person or a 40-year person, you're always learning. And so if you can overcome that and realize it's okay to be learning, it's okay to make mistakes, it's okay at some point to fail, as long as you get past that and realize, okay, tomorrow I will be better than today, that is what kind of propels you forward. Exactly. It keeps you humble. Exactly.
And then one quick little last one, and this is more of a thought or anything. We all are worried and talking about how the new world of working at home and how that fits in. And I guess what my fear was is everybody being a homebody, are there elements of culture that we're going to lose? That 20 years from now, we used to do this as all together, and now we don't do that anymore. Right. Like movie theaters are dying.
They are, and you're right.
That's
that was
a cultural thing. I mean,
happy hour.
As a kid, I paid 25 cents on a Saturday morning and I saw 4 cowboy movies every Saturday at the matinee. That was my babysitter, actually, the cinema. So how do you? I mean, that's. Do you have that? Do you have that fear?
I mean, in some
Or
ways,
is the culture
yes.
just going to evolve?
Well, I think the culture will evolve, but also too, it does now make those times in which we do gather together much more special, right? Well, I mean, so I think that whenever you do have those group of friends that can actually get together for a happy hour at this point, it's like, oh my God, this is such an amazing thing, or like a game night, which something a few years ago seemed very mundane, but now, like, I mean, again, I'm a nerd. Hello, everybody. I really enjoy the game nights I have with my friends every month or so, because we don't see each other as much as we did, and so those experiences are much more important now that they are so much more rare. So
great, thank you. And say hi to Mom to us.
Forever.
I will.
We got time for one more question. Yes, Lisa.
I do want to give a shout out to Mr. Style for joining us in the call today. I'm sure she's such a proud mom. We're excited to work with your son.
Excellent.
Thank
Paula,
you.
do we have time for one more question?
I think Lisa.
What do you play, Johnathan?
What's that?
What do you play?
What do you play, Johnathan?
What do I play? In terms of games or in terms of sports?
Yeah, the monthly game.
Oh,
Yeah.
So our last it changes, but our last game, it was actually a murder mystery game, and so they literally sent you a dossier of evidence and a photo of crime scene photos and that kind of thing, and so we spent the night solving this murder of this poor fictitious girl who was murdered by an ex-lover. So it was fun. It was fun.
We close with a question from Lisa, who asks, what architectural design elements do you see incorporated into spaces that reveal the history of our present culture?
Ooh, that's a good question. Wow. So I'm not sure if this is answering it directly, but I think this is much more of perhaps of a future thing. So there is a methodology to where, let's say, for instance, if there's an old building, you leave the facade and then build everything else new behind it, right? So there's still kind of a trace of that historic thing, but it's been involved and absorbed into a new space, right? And so I think that, overall, I think that will be us as well. I worked on a project a few years ago that was an old restaurant that had a phone booth in there, a payphone. And I begged the interior designer to keep that payphone as part of the design because that's a piece of history, right? And so, I mean, heck, at this point, I remember when floppy disks were a thing, and people who are younger than me now no longer know what those are, right? And so I think that those little technological pieces will play a role in preserving our history for future projects. Maybe also a use of whatever our contemporary standard material is will at some point be represented in a future kind of harkening back to us as well. So I think that if that answers the question, I think that's kind of probably what will eventually happen. And I think something very nuanced, I think, something that we probably won't even, know of at the time, but
that people in the future would say, wow, I can't believe they did this.
Exactly. Exactly.
Johnathan, thank you very much. It's been a brilliant interview.
Thank you for having me.
We appreciate your time.
Thank you.
And we appreciate everyone's time and attention. Thank you very much for another MOYA Talk.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johnathan. Thanks, Rodrigo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.